In a quiet town, deep in the heart of Ohio, Morgan Taylor's days moved by in gentle rhythm, shaped by her job as a librarian at the local school and her solitary evenings in a time-worn house. Since childhood, Morgan had always been drawn to silence, as if the very walls of her home guarded stories waiting for someone willing to listen. Yet, there were nights when that silence pressed closer, becoming so intense it seemed to hum with something hidden just beneath the surface. For Morgan, the unexplainable had always been like background music, easy to ignore yet somehow ever-present. She never imagined the day would come when that faint backdrop would become the center of her world. It all began on an ordinary October evening. Alone in her small study, Morgan played an old radio broadcast for comfort. Suddenly, the steady music slipped into static, transforming soft melodies into warped voices, whispering fragmented sentences. At first, Morgan assumed it was typical interference, a storm or the quirks of vintage equipment she so cherished. But these voices soon felt unmistakably directed at her, repeating names and memories that no one else could possibly know. Curiosity and fear spun together, ushering in long, sleepless nights and a relentless questioning of everything she'd believed about what was real. Over the following days, the voices became constant companions, filling every space between sleep and waking, turning even the quietest moments into opportunities for the unexplainable to reach out. Morgan tried distraction, reading, housework, anything to block them out, but the frequency followed her, growing sharper and more insistent. The peace that had always defined her home began to dissolve, replaced by a restlessness she couldn't ignore. What once seemed nothing more than superstition or the failing parts of an old radio proved to be something much darker. Morgan found herself face to face with a nightmare, one she could no longer dismiss. Morgan Taylor led a modest, orderly life, shaped by the steady rhythm of shelving books at the school library and the tranquil, tree-lined streets of her neighborhood. At 34, she had only a handful of close friends, but found comfort in brief conversations with students, the smell of dusty pages, and the slow pace of her small Midwest town. Her nights were usually filled with reading or tuning in to old radio programs, a passion handed down by her father, who collected antique radios and taught her to love the echoes of the past. Her home, a sturdy red brick house inherited from her grandmother, had always been her haven, a wall against the noise of the modern world. To her neighbors, Morgan was a creature of habit, dependable, meticulous, and rarely open to surprises. From a young age, Morgan noticed she had a peculiar sensitivity to her surroundings. While others found silence empty, she sensed it was charged with meaning, as if emotions hovered just out of sight in every room. The library, especially after hours, seemed to vibrate with unseen energy. Faint whispers in drafts, the creak of old shelves, every subtle sound heightened by her attention. Still, such impressions had always stayed within the bounds of curiosity. Superstition never weighed on her rational, practical mind. Life was comfortably predictable, cataloging books, tending the house, brewing her nightly tea. Morgan found reassurance in routine, a world where unexpected things seldom happened. Her town, with its quaint cafes and family-run stores, believed itself untouched by the extraordinary. Morgan mostly agreed, feeling shielded by the uneventful passage of days. Yet, a persistent restlessness began to grow, especially during late-night radio sessions on chilly evening. It was as if fate was preparing her for a new, unfamiliar frequency, one that would upend the peace she'd built so carefully. Unbeknownst to her, Morgan stood on the threshold of something her routines could never prepare her for. On those wind-blown nights, with the faintest static whispering through the radio, the true nightmare was drawing closer to her frequency. The evening began like any other for Morgan, the soothing rhythms of her radio filling the empty house after a day of shelving books and reorganizing stacks. But while making her favorite tea, something shifted. An abrupt interference cut through the music, replacing gentle tunes with a low, unsettling hum. Morgan tried changing stations, but static consumed every frequency, and beneath it, distorted voices began to surface. At first, she figured it was nothing more than the quirks of her vintage set. Old radios like hers often faltered when the weather grew cold. Yet as those voices grew clearer, unease hardened into a fear she could not ignore. Through that long, sleepless night, the voices grew more than mere noise. They began to whisper fragments of phrases, names pulled from Morgan's own memory, memories, personal details no static could explain. Terrified, she turned the radio off again and again, but the echoes lingered, weaving themselves through her thoughts, as though the frequency had embedded itself in her mind. Morgan found herself paralyzed, unable to make sense of this haunting. She tried convincing herself it was exhaustion or an overactive imagination, but the uncanny accuracy of what she heard was impossible to dismiss. Room by room, her home filled with dread, transforming from sanctuary to a stage for the unexplainable. Confusion seeped into the days that followed. Morgan barely slept, keeping a watchful eye on the radio as if it were a gateway to something far more sinister. At work, she faltered, misfiling books and withdrawing from colleagues, too afraid of sounding unhinged if she revealed her fears. The terror was amplified by isolation. The more she tried to escape the voices, the more insistent they became, echoing both in her house's dark corners and deep inside her mind. What started as a small technical anomaly had become a turning point she couldn't reverse. She stood facing something she couldn't name, unable to guess how far it would reach or if her old peace would ever return. Desperate for answers, Morgan tried every possible approach. She started with logic, double-checking chords, testing other antique radios, searching for technical explanations online, and poring over user manuals. She even visited Mr. Carter, the elderly radio repairman down the street, but nothing accounted for the voices that felt so pointed and personal. Each attempt at regaining control only left her feeling more helpless. As night followed night, the radio's frequency seemed to merge with the echoing sounds in her mind. Now, even in utter silence, Morgan was stalked by whispering words that refused to fade, pulling her into an exhausting cycle of fear and relentless searching. As days slipped by, the voices began to disrupt her routines. Enigmatic messages would surface as she made coffee, lost memories were conjured in unlikely corners of her home, and sometimes the words seemed to carry intent. Morgan took to keeping journals, trying to transcribe what she heard, hoping for some connection or pattern to emerge. She found herself torn between total isolation and the desperate urge to confide in someone who might understand. For a moment, she considered reaching out to her childhood friend, Olivia, but fear of being dismissed as unstable held her back. Solitude became her greatest punishment, yet her only defense. One night, a turning point arrived. As the voices grew louder, Morgan realized their whispers alternated between warnings and pleas, as though they were asking for help or guiding her to uncover something hidden at home. Gathering her courage, she searched through every room, hunting for unusual symbols, secret compartments, or any tangible clue. Despite her terror, she felt a flicker of determination ignite within. For the first time since the ordeal began, Morgan sensed a purpose to the voices, a mission or calling, not merely torment. Though fear persisted, it now shared space with an unfamiliar strength, empowering her to confront the unknown. As days stretched into weeks, Morgan began to sense a subtle shift, first in the nature of the voices, then in herself as she confronted the inexplicable. The fear that had once ruled every thought was slowly giving way to understanding. Through her journals, she started to perceive patterns in what was whispered, realizing the voices carried echoes of long-forgotten stories buried deep within the house and the town itself. Discovering a hidden cache of old letters in the attic, accounts from people who had once lived on her very street, wove Morgan's story deeper into the fabric of the place. Each discovery transformed anxiety into an almost obsessive quest for meaning, turning dread into a puzzle she was now determined to solve. By facing the memories and puzzles head-on, Morgan began to communicate with the voices, sometimes aloud, sometimes in thought, as if she were conversing with old companions. The terror of the unknown gradually softened, replaced by a strange sense of connection and even gratitude. Rather than fleeing the phenomenon, Morgan created small rituals of acknowledgement, believing that by honoring the suffering and messages of these voices, she might bring peace not only to her home, but to herself. Her once sleepless, fearful nights became something else. The whispers still lingered, but their message shifted. Silence returned, now imbued with meaning, tempered no longer by dread but by empathy. The experience transformed Morgan, leaving an indelible mark on her life. Her routines never returned to what they were before, but she found within herself a strength she had never known. Her home became more than a shelter. It was now a vessel for memory and purpose. In embracing what she could not control, Morgan redefined her own values, learning that it is through confronting the unknown that we are truly changed, able not just to alter our destinies, but to help those who come after us. Having broken the cycle of fear, she finally found both peace and meaning, a harmony between her own frequency and the voices from beyond. At the end of her ordeal, Morgan Taylor became a subtle symbol of quiet courage to a community that had once seen her only as the reserved town librarian. The experiences she endured left deep marks, not only on her own spirit, but on how she viewed the world around her. The impossible slowly lost its power over her. She learned to welcome what was once a source of fear, turning it into a dialogue with a forgotten past and giving new meaning to both her own story and the memory of the place she called home. More than simply overcoming nightmares or mysterious voices, Morgan discovered the value of acceptance, of the forces that stir from within and those that seep in through the cracks of the unknown. Her journey encouraged others to regard the inexplicable with less hesitation and more curiosity, inspiring people to seek meaning in even the strangest experiences, no matter how frightening. In doing so, she transformed her life into a bridge between worlds, proving that real courage lies in listening, understanding, and turning fear into a starting point for change. The legacy of that season was not made only of answers, but of doors opened by Morgan's willingness to face what others never dared name. And in every silent corner of her house and her town, the invitation remained: listen closely, for there are always frequencies beyond what we believe we know.